The morning of November 10th, 1882, dawned with the kind of bitter cold that could kill a man in minutes. The Dakota territory stretched endlessly under a pewter sky, its vast plains scoured by winds that carried ice crystals sharp enough to draw blood from exposed skin. At 7:30 in the morning, the temperature had already dropped to 18 degrees below zero, and the wind howled across the frozen landscape like a living thing bent on destruction. Under the broken remains of a covered wagon, two small figures pressed against their mother's corpse, seeking warmth that had fled days ago. 7-year-old Josie Patterson held her 5-year-old sister May, with arms that trembled from exhaustion and hypothermia. Their mother, Mary Patterson, had died 3 days earlier, her body now frozen solid as winter stone, her face peaceful but gray as old marble. Josie's mind kept returning to the final moments, watching her mother's breath grow shallow and irregular. "Take care of May," had been Mary's last whispered words, spoken through lips already blue with cold. "Promise me, Josie. Promise me you'll keep her safe." The memory of that promise now felt like a weight pressing down on her chest, heavier than her sister's small body curled against her. "Josie." May whispered, her voice barely audible above the keening wind. "My tummy hurts so bad. When are we going to eat again?" Josie's own stomach had moved beyond hunger into a hollow ache that gnawed at her constantly. They had eaten nothing for 6 days, except leather strips torn from the wagon harness leather, so tough it had made their gums bleed and their teeth ache. The metallic taste of blood had become familiar, almost comforting in its consistency. "Try to sleep, May," Josie said, though she knew sleep meant death. Every time May's eyes closed, Josie shook her awake, terrified that her sister would slip away like their mother had. May's tears had frozen on her cheeks, leaving tiny crystals that caught what little light filtered through the storm clouds. "I can't feel my fingers," May whimpered, holding up her small hands. Her fingertips had turned white with frostbite, and Josie could see the skin beginning to blacken at the edges. "Put them under your arms," Josie instructed, though she knew it would do little good. Her own feet had lost feeling 2 days ago, and she could barely move her toes inside her thin shoes. The wind shifted suddenly, carrying a new sound that made both girls freeze with primal terror. From the ridge above came the distinctive yipping of coyotes, not the mournful howling of distant animals, but the excited chatter that meant they had found prey. Yellow eyes appeared first gleaming in the swirling snow, then lean bodies began picking their way down the slope with predatory patience. The pack leader, a grizzled male with battle scars across his muzzle, and one torn ear, tested the wind and caught the scent of death and helplessness. He barked once a sharp command that brought 6 other coyotes into formation. They had learned to be patient with human prey, to wait until weakness made the kills safe and easy. May began to sob, the sound lost in the wind. "Josie, they're coming closer. I can see their teeth. Don't look at them," Josie whispered, though her own eyes remained fixed on the approaching predators. She had seen what coyotes could do to a newborn calf, had heard the ranchers' stories of what they would do to children left alone. "Just hold on to me tight." The coyotes crept closer, their paws silent on the frozen ground. 20 yards became 15, then 10. The pack leader's muscles tensed for the final rush, his lips pulling back to reveal yellowed fangs. Then, cutting through the storm like thunder rolling across the plains, came the sound of horse hooves striking frozen earth. Red Elk pulled his paint stallion to a halt at the crest of the ridge, his weathered face set in grim lines as he surveyed the scene below. At 53, the Lakota chief carried the accumulated scars of a lifetime spent defending his people. A jagged scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, a reminder of a cavalry saber that had nearly killed him at the Battle of the Rosebud 7 years earlier. His right leg bore the permanent damage of a cavalry bullet, leaving him with a pronounced limp that grew worse in cold weather like this. His long black hair, now streaked with premature silver, whipped in the wind as he raised his hand to signal the 4 warriors who rode with him. They had been tracking a wounded elk since dawn, when the thin column of smoke from the distant wagon had caught their attention. "Elk coyotes," he said in Lakota to his son Running Bear, who rode at his right side. "They smell weakness and approaching death." Running Bear, 22 years old with his father's strong jaw and keen dark eyes, had already pulled his rifle from its leather scabbard. "Father, there are children down there. Living children." Red Elk's heart clenched as he watched the 2 small figures huddled beneath the wagon. The sight transported him instantly back 2 winters to a fire-lit teepee where his own daughter had died of fever in his arms. Little Singing Bird had been May's age when death took her, and her loss had carved a wound in Red Elk's soul that never fully healed. He still heard her laughter in his dreams, still felt the weight of her small body against his chest. Fire warning shots. Red Elk commanded his voice, carrying the authority of a man who had led warriors into battle against impossible odds. "Drive the pack away from the children immediately." Running Bear's rifle cracked 3 times in rapid succession, the sharp reports echoing across the frozen landscape. The coyotes scattered like gray ghosts, their opportunity lost, melting back into the storm with disappointed yips. Red Elk guided his horse down the treacherous slope, his hunting party following in careful single file. The wind had sculpted the snow into knife-sharp ridges that could cut a horse's legs, and the ice made every step dangerous. As they reached the wagon, the full extent of the tragedy became clear. The woman beneath the canvas covering was frozen solid, her skin the color of old ivory, her clothing stiff with ice. But the children, their small chests, still rose and fell with desperate, shallow breaths. "Please don't hurt us," Josie whispered as Red Elk dismounted, her voice cracking with terror and exhaustion. "We haven't done anything wrong. We're just trying to stay alive." Red Elk's expression softened as he approached the girls, his movements slow and deliberate to avoid frightening them further. He had seen many terrible things in his long life, but the sight of children abandoned to die always stirred something protective in his nature. "I will not harm you, young ones," he said in heavily accented English, his voice gentle as summer rain. "I am here to help you continue living." He began unwrapping the thick buffalo hide from his own shoulders, ignoring the immediate bite of cold against his skin. The hide was thick and warm, lined with rabbit fur that his wife had sewn with painstaking care during the long winter evenings. As he wrapped it around both girls, May's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and glazed with hypothermia. "Mama," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. Red Elk's throat tightened with emotion. He had spoken those same words to his own mother when fever had taken her during his childhood on the plains. "Your mother walks with the spirits now, little one. But you still walk among the living, and you must continue to do so." He lifted both girls onto his horse, their combined weight surprisingly light. They felt fragile as bird bones in his arms, their small bodies radiating cold instead of warmth. As he settled them in front of him on the saddle, May's head lolled against his chest, and he could feel her heart beating rapidly with the stress of survival. Swift wind. Red Elk called to one of his warriors, "Wrap the woman's body in canvas. We will return it to the white soldiers when they come searching." "They will come searching," Running Bear said grimly, his young face showing wisdom beyond his years. "When they find us with white children, they will not want to hear explanations." Red Elk nodded, understanding the truth in his son's words. The relationship between the Lakota and the white settlers had grown increasingly violent over the past decade. Every encounter was viewed through the lens of suspicion and hatred. But as he felt the girl's breathing grow slightly steadier in the warmth of the buffalo hide, he knew he had made the only choice his conscience would allow. "Some things matter more than safety," he said quietly. "These children have already lost their mother. they will not lose their lives as well. The journey back to the winter camp took 3 hours through treacherous terrain. Red Elk's people had chosen their location with the tactical wisdom of generations, a protected valley, where the wind could not reach, surrounded by high bluffs that provided natural defense and concealment. The teepees were arranged in a traditional circle, their buffalo hide walls glowing warmly in the pale afternoon light. As they approached the camp, Red Elk could feel the weight of his people's stares. Everyone understood immediately the danger he had brought among them. Saving white children was an act of compassion, but it was also an act of war in the eyes of the territorial authorities. "Take them to Gray Owl Woman," Red Elk instructed as they dismounted. "Tell her they have been without food for many days. Their bodies must learn to accept nourishment slowly, or they will die from our kindness." Gray Owl Woman, but the tribe's most skilled medicine woman, took one look at the children and immediately began issuing rapid instructions to her assistants. At 68, she had delivered half the babies in the tribe and had seen every form of suffering the human body could endure. The warm broth, but only small amounts, she commanded in rapid Lakota. "And prepare the frostbite medicine. Their fingers and toes show the white death." As the medicine women worked, Red Elk sat beside the central fire, watching the girls' faces gradually regain some color. May remained unconscious, but her breathing had steadied and deepened. Josie's eyes darted around the teepee, taking in the unfamiliar surroundings with the wariness of a child who had learned not to trust easily. "Why?" she asked suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why what, young one? Why did you save us? We're not your people. Everyone says Indians and white people are enemies." Red Elk considered the question, carefully understanding that his answer would shape how this child viewed the world for the rest of her life. "All children are my people when they are dying. This is what separates us from the wolves and the coyotes." Before Josie could respond, the teepee flap opened. An eagle feather entered his weathered face, grave with concern. The elderly warrior had fought beside Red Elk in many battles, and his lined face showed the weight of hard-won wisdom. "Chief," said formally, "the Council of Elders wishes to speak with you urgently." Red Elk stepped outside into the bitter cold, where 6 tribal elders waited in a semicircle. Their breath formed clouds as they spoke in urgent whispers, their faces etched with the kind of worry that came from watching their people suffer for decades. "You have brought great danger to our people," Eagle Feather said without preamble. "The cavalry will accuse us of kidnapping these children. They will not distinguish between rescue and abduction. The white soldiers see only what serves their purposes," added Stone Bull, another elder whose own son had died in a cavalry raid 5 years earlier. "They will not listen to truth when lies serve their interests better." Red Elk faced the circle of worried faces. These men had watched their own children die from cavalry bullets, had seen their families driven from traditional lands and confined to reservations. Their fear was not cowardice, but the practical wisdom of survivors who understood the cost of white man's justice. "If I had done nothing," Red Elk replied, his voice steady as granite, "those children would be dead by nightfall. The coyotes would have torn them apart while they still lived. Would you have me abandon children to such a fate? The white man's children are not our responsibility," Stone Bull argued. "We have our own families to protect from their soldiers' revenge. When children are dying, they become everyone's responsibility," Red Elk countered. "This is what makes us human instead of beasts. This is what makes us worthy of the Creator's regard." The argument continued for over an hour, voices rising and falling in the ancient rhythms of tribal debate. But Red Elk's mind was settled. He would not abandon the girls regardless of the consequences. As dawn approached on November 12th, that resolve would be tested by the arrival of Lieutenant Samuel Grady and his cavalry patrol. The sound of approaching horses at 7 in the morning brought every warrior in the camp to immediate alertness. Red Elk emerged from his teepee to see 12 soldiers in blue uniforms riding into the valley, their rifles held ready for action. At their head rode a young officer whose ambitious eyes and perfectly groomed appearance marked him as a man hungry for advancement. Lieutenant Samuel Grady, 26 years old and 3 years out of West Point, had been assigned to this remote territory as punishment for a gambling scandal that had involved a colonel's daughter and a substantial sum of money. He saw every incident as an opportunity to redeem his career and secure the promotion that would return him to civilization and respectability. "Where are the kidnapped children?" Grady demanded, without dismounting his voice, carrying across the camp with practiced military authority. Red Elk walked forward slowly, his hands clearly visible at his sides. He had faced cavalry officers before and knew that any sudden movement could trigger a massacre that would claim innocent lives. "The children are safe and receiving medical care. They were dying of cold and hunger when we found them. You will surrender them to me immediately." Grady commanded his hand, moving to rest on his pistol grip. "Any resistance will be considered an act of war against the United States of America." Red Elk glanced back toward the medicine lodge where he could see Josie's face peering through the entrance flap. The girl's eyes were wide with confusion, as if she couldn't understand why soldiers were treating her rescuers as enemies. "There is no need for weapons here," Red Elk said calmly. "I will bring the children to you without trouble." Inside the medicine lodge, both girls were awake and dressed in warm clothes provided by the tribal women. May clutched a small carved wooden horse that Gray Owl Woman had given her, while Josie held a cup of warm broth with hands that no longer shook from cold. "The blue soldiers have come for you," Red Elk said gently as he knelt beside them. "They will take you to the white settlements where you belong." May's eyes immediately filled with tears. "I don't want to go with them. They look angry. I want to stay here with you and the nice ladies." Red Elk's heart broke a little as he lifted May into his arms. She was so light, so fragile, and yet she had survived things that would have killed grown men. "You cannot stay here, little one. Your own people are waiting for you, but you're our people now." Josie said, her voice stronger than her sister's, but still trembling with emotion. "You saved our lives. That makes you family, doesn't it? And that bond will never be broken." Red Elk replied, his voice thick with emotion. "But you must go where you belong, where you can grow up safely." As he carried May outside with Josie walking beside him, the sight of the mounted soldiers made May cling tighter to his neck. Her small body trembled with fear of these strangers, who had come to take her away from the only safety she had known in days. "It will be all right," Red Elk whispered to her, speaking in English so she would understand. "Remember that you are braver than you know. Remember that you survived impossible things." Lieutenant Grady dismounted as they approached his expression, a mixture of disgust and barely concealed excitement. This incident would make an excellent report for his superiors, especially if he embellished the details properly for maximum dramatic effect. "Step away from the children, Redskin," he ordered coldly, his voice carrying the casual contempt of a man who had never seen Indians as fully human. Red Elk gently set May down, but she immediately wrapped her arms around his leg, sobbing. "Don't leave me. Please don't leave me. I'll be good. I promise." A young soldier moved forward to pull the girl away, but Red Elk held up his hand. "Please, officer. Allow me one moment to comfort her properly." Grady nodded curtly, already composing his report in his mind. The image of a savage reluctantly surrendering white children would play well with his superiors. Red Elk knelt to May's level, his voice soft but urgent. "Listen to me carefully, little one. I will always be with you here." He placed his weathered hand over her small heart. "Remember that you are stronger than you know. Remember that you are loved." May nodded through her tears, then allowed the soldier to lead her to the horses. As she was lifted onto a cavalry mount, she looked back at Red Elk with an expression of heartbreak that would haunt him for years to come. Josie followed more reluctantly, her small jaw set with determination that reminded Red Elk of her mother's fierce spirit. "I'm going to tell them the truth about what happened," she said to Red Elk, her voice carrying a conviction that belied her 7 years. "I'm going to tell everyone that you saved us. Be careful what truths you speak, child." Red Elk replied quietly. Sometimes people prefer lies that match their beliefs to truths that challenge them. As the soldiers prepared to depart, Lieutenant Grady turned to Red Elk with a cold smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You're under arrest for kidnapping, unlawful imprisonment, and suspected murder. You will be transported to Cottonwood Bend to stand trial for your crimes." Red Elk offered no resistance as the soldiers bound his hands with rough rope. He had expected this moment from the instant he decided to save the girls. As he was led away from his camp, he caught sight of Running Bear's face twisted with helpless rage and the desire for violent revenge. "Now do not seek vengeance." Red Elk called out in Lakota, his voice carrying the authority of a chief and the wisdom of a father. "Violence will only bring more suffering to our people. Let them judge me by their laws." The 3-day journey to Cottonwood Bend gave Lieutenant Grady ample time to craft and refine his story. By the time they reached the frontier settlement on the evening of November 15th, his account had transformed from a simple recovery of lost children into a heroic raid against savage kidnappers who had murdered the children's mother in cold blood. Cottonwood Bend was a collection of weathered wooden buildings clustered around a muddy main street that turned to treacherous ice in winter. The general store, saloon, church, and handful of houses represented the furthest edge of white civilization in this part of the Dakota Territory. The arrival of the cavalry patrol at sunset drew every resident into the street, their faces eager for news and excitement that might break the monotony of frontier life. "Ladies and gentlemen," Lieutenant Grady announced from horseback, his voice carrying the practiced authority of a man who had found his moment of glory. "I present to you 2 innocent children rescued from the savage Indians who murdered their mother and held them captive for their own evil purposes." The crowd erupted in cheers and applause. Word spread quickly through the settlement, and within an hour, nearly every resident of Cottonwood Bend had gathered to hear the tale of the heroic rescue. "How long were you held prisoner?" demanded Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife, her voice sharp with morbid curiosity. "Did the savages try to harm you?" asked Mr. Crenshaw, who owned the town's only saloon and had been drinking heavily since the soldiers' arrival. "Were you forced to participate in heathen rituals?" pressed Reverend Matthews, his eyes gleaming with the kind of righteous indignation that made good sermon material. Josie tried to answer, tried to explain that they had been saved rather than captured, but her small voice was lost in the chaos of questions and assumptions. The adults spoke over her, around her, but never seemed to actually hear her words. "They gave us warm food," she managed to say during a brief lull in the questioning. "Probably drugged," someone muttered. "They wrapped us in warm blankets." May added, her voice barely audible. "To keep you alive for their purposes," another voice suggested darkly. Through it all, Red Elk was marched to the town jail, a squat stone building that had been constructed more for intimidation than security. The structure was solid enough to hold a man, but small enough to make imprisonment a claustrophobic ordeal. As he was locked in the single cell, he could hear the crowd outside growing larger and more agitated with each passing hour. "We should string him up tonight," someone shouted from the street. "Save the territory, the expense of a trial," added another voice. "Make an example of him for the other tribes," came a third suggestion. Red Elk sat on the narrow wooden cot in his cell and closed his eyes, trying to block out the sounds of growing mob violence. He had saved 2 children from certain death, and for this act of mercy, he would likely pay with his life. But as he remembered May's small hand in his, the warmth that had slowly returned to both girls' faces, he felt no regret for his actions. Outside, the crowd continued to grow as riders spread word throughout the territory. Lieutenant Grady stood on the steps of the general store, retelling his fabricated story to anyone who would listen, each version more dramatic and heroic than the last. With each telling, the rescue became more daring, the danger more extreme, and his own role more central to the children's salvation. 3 men watched the proceedings with very different emotions. Dr. Samuel Morrison, the town's 72-year-old physician, observed the mob with the clinical detachment of a man who had seen too much frontier violence. His failing eyesight made it difficult to see faces clearly in the gathering darkness. But his mind remained sharp as a surgical blade, and he could sense the dangerous mood building in the crowd. Sheriff Tom Bradley, a weathered man of 45, who had worn the badge for 12 years, stood with his hand resting on his pistol, knowing that maintaining law and order might soon become impossible. He had seen lynch mobs before, had watched good men transform into animals when their blood was up, and their judgment clouded by alcohol and righteous fury. And in the shadows near the blacksmith's shop, David Two Horses worked late at his forge, the rhythmic hammering of red-hot metal providing a counterpoint to the crowd's angry voices. At 26, David was known throughout the town as a skilled craftsman and a man who kept his own counsel. Most residents assumed he was Mexican or perhaps part Indian, but few bothered to ask questions, as long as he produced quality work for reasonable prices. What they didn't know was that David's father had been a Lakota warrior named Swift Arrow, who had died fighting Custer's forces at the Little Bighorn 6 years earlier. His mother, a white woman named Sarah Two Horses, had been cast out by her own people for her relationship with a Native American. David had grown up straddling 2 worlds fully accepted by neither, but he had learned to navigate both with careful observation and quiet courage. As the mob's voices grew uglier and more threatening, David found himself thinking about his father's stories of honor and individual courage. Swift Arrow had taught him that a man's worth was measured not by his blood, but by his actions, not by the color of his skin, but by the contents of his character. Now watching an innocent man being condemned for an act of mercy, David felt the weight of that teaching pressing down on him like a physical burden. The crowd outside the jail had grown to over 100 people by 10 o'clock that evening, and their faces illuminated by torches and oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on the stone walls. Red Elk could hear their voices through the thick walls, the anger building like a storm gathering strength over the plains. "That savage butchered their mother in cold blood," shouted Jake Crenshaw, who had been drinking heavily at his own saloon before joining the mob. "Probably planned to sell the children to other tribes," added Tom Fletcher, a local rancher whose own family had been killed in an Indian raid 10 years earlier. "We all know what Indians do to white women and children," came another voice from the crowd, to the speaker's identity lost in the mass of angry faces. Dr. Morrison pushed through the crowd with his medical bag, his elderly frame moving with surprising determination. "Let me pass," he commanded, his voice carrying the authority of age and professional respect. "I need to examine the children medically." At the Morrison house, Josie and May sat at the kitchen table, while the doctor's wife Helen prepared their first real meal in over a week. The girls had been bathed and clothed in donated dresses from the church, their hair brushed and braided by gentle hands that reminded them of their mother's touch. Dr. Morrison knelt beside May, his practiced hands checking her pulse and examining her fingers for signs of permanent frostbite damage. "How are you feeling, little one?" "Much better, thank you." May whispered, her voice still weak but steadier than it had been in days. "The Indian chief gave us warm soup and soft blankets. He was very kind to us. The chief took good care of us." Josie added, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. "He saved us from the wild animals that wanted to hurt us." Dr. Morrison frowned, his medical training alerting him to important details. What animals were these? Coyotes. May explained with the matter-of-fact tone that children use to describe terrifying experiences. They were going to eat us alive, but Chief Red Elk scared them away with his big horse and his warriors. The doctor exchanged meaningful glances with his wife. In his 45 years of medical practice, he had developed a keen ability to distinguish between truth and fabrication, especially when it came to children's testimony. These girls were describing events with the kind of specific detail that suggested genuine experience, not coached responses. Tell me everything that happened," he said gently, from the very beginning. Josie took a deep breath and began their story. She described their mother's gradual weakening from cold and hunger, and the way Mary had tried to keep them warm, even as she grew weaker, her death 3 days before the rescue. She told of the desperate days spent huddled under the wagon, trying to eat leather strips from the harness, watching the coyotes circle closer each day. Mama stopped talking on the 3rd day. Josie said, her voice barely above a whisper. She just got very quiet, and then she stopped moving. We tried to wake her up, but she was too cold. He found this in Mama's pocket, May added, pulling out a simple gold wedding ring. He said I should keep it to remember her by. Dr. Morrison took the ring and examined it carefully under his magnifying glass. The band was worn smooth by years of wear, and inside he could see a faint but clear inscription, "To my beloved Mary, 1870. The Indian chief gave this to you personally?" he asked quietly. "He said Mama was already with the spirits when he found us," Josie explained. "He said she wouldn't need her ring anymore, but that we should never forget her or stop loving her." Dr. Morrison felt a cold certainty settle in his chest. If Red Elk had murdered the girl's mother, he would never have given them such a precious and incriminating keepsake. More importantly, the man's behavior as described by the children was that of a protector and healer, not a predator or killer. "Doctor," Helen Morrison whispered, pulling him aside, "surely you don't think—" "I think we need to examine the mother's body immediately," Dr. Morrison said grimly. "Before this situation gets completely out of hand and an innocent man is murdered by a mob." Meanwhile, at the jail, Sheriff Bradley was struggling to maintain order as the crowd grew more volatile with each passing hour. Jake Crenshaw had been passing a bottle of whiskey through the crowd, and many of the men were now drunk as well as angry. A combination that had led to violence many times before in frontier towns. "Sheriff," called out Crenshaw, weaving slightly on his feet, "why don't you just step aside and let justice take its natural course? Because justice happens in a courtroom, not in the street." Bradley replied firmly, his hand never leaving his weapon. "Red Elk will receive a fair trial under the law of this territory." "The law is too slow for savage killers," argued Tom Fletcher, his voice slurred with alcohol and grief. "That Indian could escape, or his whole tribe could come for him before we get our justice." "Oh, the law is what separates civilized men from animals," Bradley shot back. "Without it, we're no better than the wolves that hunt in packs." As the argument continued, David Two Horses made his way through the crowd toward the jail. His mixed heritage had taught him to move quietly and observe carefully, skills that served him well now as he navigated through the hostile crowd. He had been thinking about his father's stories about the warrior code that demanded individual courage in the face of injustice. That night, David had experienced a vivid dream that had left him shaken. He had seen his father, Swift Arrow, standing in a circle of warriors speaking about honor and family bonds. In the dream, Swift Arrow had pointed to a figure in the shadows and said, "My brother leads with wisdom, but he will need courage from unexpected places." David had awakened with a strange sense of urgency, as if the dream was trying to tell him something important. Near the back of the jail, a small barred window provided ventilation to the cell. David approached it cautiously, checking to make sure no one was watching his movements. "Chief Red Elk," he whispered through the bars. Red Elk looked up from his meditation, his keen eyes adjusting to the darkness. "Who speaks to me in the shadows?" "Someone who understands what it means to be caught between two worlds." David replied in careful English, his voice barely audible above the crowd's noise. "Why do you risk yourself for a stranger?" David was quiet for a long moment, then spoke a few words in halting Lakota that his father had taught him. "Because my father taught me that sometimes the only way to honor our ancestors is to stand up for what is right, even when it's dangerous." Red Elk's eyes widened slightly with interest. "You have Lakota blood running in your veins. My father was called Swift Arrow. He fell fighting at the greasy grass, defending our people's way of life." Red Elk was silent for a long moment, his mind racing. "Swift Arrow," he repeated softly. "I knew him well. He was a brave warrior and a man of great honor." "Tell me, what did he look like?" "Tall, with a scar across his left hand from a knife fight. He carried a rifle with eagle feathers tied to the barrel. And he had a habit of humming while he worked on his weapons," Red Elk added quietly. David's eyes widened. "Yes. How did you know that?" "Because Swift Arrow was my younger brother," Red Elk said simply. "Which means you are my nephew, though neither of us knew it until this moment." The revelation hung in the air between them, like a physical presence. David felt a surge of emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. All his life, he had wondered about his father's family, about the connections he had lost when Swift Arrow died. He said quietly, using the Lakota term of respect. "I will not let them murder you. You cannot stop an entire mob," Red Elk replied. "And I will not have you die for my sake." "My father would have stood up for his brother," David said firmly. "I can do no less." Their conversation was interrupted by approaching footsteps. Dr. Morrison emerged from the shadows, his face set with grim determination, and carrying a document that would change everything. "Chief Red Elk," the doctor said quietly, "I need to ask you about the children's mother and the circumstances of her death." Red Elk stood and approached the barred window. "She was already dead when we found the children. Dead for several days, I believe, from the cold and starvation." "How could you be so certain of the timing, the smell, the condition of the body, the way the children spoke of her?" "She had been frozen solid for days. The children were eating leather strips from the wagon harness. They had been without food for many days before we found them." Dr. Morrison nodded gravely. "I suspected as much from examining the children. I intend to examine the body tomorrow morning, and I believe I'll find evidence that supports your account completely." "Will it matter?" Red Elk asked. "Will truth be enough to overcome their hatred and desire for revenge?" Dr. Morrison looked toward the mob, their torches casting dancing shadows on the jail walls. "I pray it will be. But I fear that hope may not be sufficient to save your life." As the doctor prepared to leave, David stepped forward. "There may be another way to ensure justice," he said quietly. "But it would require great risk and perfect timing." "What do you mean?" Dr. Morrison asked. "Sometimes the only way to save a life is to put your own life in danger," David replied. "My father taught me that individual courage is not the absence of fear, but action in spite of fear." The next morning, November 16th, dawned clear and bitterly cold. Dr. Morrison spent the early hours examining Mary Patterson's body, which had been brought to his clinic by the cavalry patrol. His findings were conclusive and deeply disturbing for the prosecution's case. The woman had indeed died of exposure and starvation, with absolutely no signs of violence or trauma. The condition of her body indicated she had been dead for at least 3 days, possibly 4 before the children were found. More importantly, her hands showed no defensive wounds, her clothing was intact and undisturbed. and there was no evidence whatsoever of foul play. Armed with this medical evidence, Dr. Morrison went to speak with Judge William Hartwell, who had arrived on the morning stage to preside over the trial. Hartwell, a stern man in his 60s with silver hair and calculating political eyes, had been appointed to this territorial position more for his connections in Washington than his legal expertise. On a judge, Dr. Morrison said, presenting his findings, "I have medical evidence that calls into serious question the charges against Red Elk. The trial will proceed as scheduled this afternoon." Hartwell replied curtly, barely glancing at the medical report. "All evidence will be presented in court according to proper legal procedure. But surely the medical facts clearly demonstrate will be evaluated by the jury." Hartwell interrupted. "I will not prejudge this case based on preliminary findings, Doctor. The law must take its course." Dr. Morrison left the meeting with a growing sense of dread. He had hoped that scientific evidence would be enough to prevent a miscarriage of justice. But he was beginning to understand that this trial was about more. It was about more than facts. It was about satisfying the community's need for revenge and Lieutenant Grady's need for career advancement. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity when the trial began at 2 o'clock that afternoon. The wooden building that normally served as a church and community meeting hall had been hastily converted for legal proceedings. People stood along the walls and crowded the doorways, their faces eager for what they expected to be swift and decisive justice. Judge Hartwell called the court to order with 3 sharp raps of his gavel. "The territory of Dakota versus Chief Red Elk," he announced in a voice that carried clearly through the packed room. "The defendant stands charged with kidnapping in the first degree, unlawful imprisonment, and murder in the first degree." Prosecutor James Whitman, an ambitious young lawyer from back east, who saw this case as his pathway to political prominence, rose to address the jury. Whitman was 32 years old, Harvard-educated, and convinced that frontier justice was simply a matter of confirming what everyone already believed to be true. "Gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice carrying the polished authority of formal education, "we are here today to seek justice for 2 innocent children who were torn from their murdered mother by a savage who intended to raise them as his own heathen offspring." The crowd murmured its approval, but Judge Hartwell banged his gavel sharply for silence. "The evidence will show." Whitman continued pacing before the jury like a theatrical performer, "that this defendant murdered Mary Patterson in cold blood, then kidnapped her innocent children with the deliberate intention of indoctrinating them into his barbarous way of life. This is not merely a crime against these specific victims. It is an act of war against Christian civilization itself." Red Elk's appointed defender, Thomas Fletcher, was a nervous young man, barely 2 years out of law school, who had drawn this assignment by misfortune. He had never handled a case involving capital charges, and his inexperience showed in his trembling hands and uncertain voice. "Your Honor," Fletcher said, rising unsteadily, "I object to the prosecutor's inflammatory characterization of my client. The evidence will show that Chief Red Elk acted as a rescuer, not a kidnapper." "Objection overruled," Judge Hartwell said curtly. "The jury will disregard the defense's editorial comments. Continue, Mr. Whitman." As Whitman presented his case throughout the afternoon, he called a series of witnesses who painted Red Elk as a brutal savage. Lieutenant Grady's testimony was particularly damaging, filled with fabricated details about the rescue mission and Red Elk's supposed lack of remorse. The defendant showed no emotion whatsoever when forced to surrender the children. Grady testified, his voice ringing with manufactured conviction. He handed them over with the cold indifference of a man who had accomplished his evil purpose and been caught in the act. "Who knows what unspeakable horrors those innocent children might have suffered if I hadn't tracked them down with my patrol." The crowd responded with approving murmurs and angry shouts. Josie and May, sitting in the front row with Mrs. Henderson, watched the proceedings with growing confusion and distress. "Why are they saying such terrible things about Chief Red Elk?" May whispered to her sister, her small voice breaking with emotion. "Because they don't want to hear the truth." Josie replied, her jaw set with determination that seemed far beyond her 7 years. "But we know what really happened, and someday everyone else will too." As the day wore on, the prosecution built what seemed to be an overwhelming case. Witness after witness testified to Red Elk's supposed guilt, their accounts growing more dramatic and damning with each telling. The mood in the courtroom was one of barely contained violence, with many spectators openly calling for immediate execution. But Dr. Morrison had been working behind the scenes, and he was not finished fighting for justice. On the morning of November 17th, as the trial resumed, Fletcher called his first witness. "I call Dr. Samuel Morrison to the stand." Dr. Morrison approached the witness chair with the dignity of a man who had spent his life serving others. He carried a leather satchel containing his medical findings and documentation. "Dr. Morrison," Fletcher began, "did you examine the body of Mary Patterson?" "I did, sir. I conducted a thorough medical examination yesterday morning." "What were your findings regarding the cause of death?" "Mary Patterson died of exposure and starvation. There were no signs of violence, no wounds, no trauma of any kind. She died a natural death brought on by the harsh conditions." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. This was not what many had expected to hear. "Doctor," Fletcher continued, "in your medical opinion, how long had Mrs. Patterson been dead before her body was discovered?" "Based on the condition of the body and the rate of decomposition in these temperatures, I would estimate she had been dead for at least 3 days, possibly 4. "And what does this timeline suggest about the defendant's involvement in her death?" Prosecutor Whitman jumped to his feet. "Objection! The witness is being asked to speculate." Sustained. Judge Hartwell ruled, "The jury will disregard the question." But the damage was done. The medical evidence clearly contradicted the prosecution's timeline, and several jurors were now looking uncertain. Fletcher pressed on. "Dr. Morrison, did you also examine the children?" "I did. Both girls showed signs of severe malnutrition and frostbite. They had been without proper food for many days. In your opinion, what would have happened to these children if they had not been found when they were?" "They would have died within hours," Dr. Morrison stated firmly. "They were already in the final stages of hypothermia and starvation." The courtroom erupted in confused murmurs. The prosecution's case was beginning to show cracks, but Whitman was far from finished. When court resumed after lunch, Whitman called his surprise witness. The prosecution calls Lieutenant Samuel Grady to the stand for additional testimony. Grady approached the witness chair with a document in his hand, his face set with grim determination. "Your Honor, I have discovered new evidence that changes everything about this case." He presented a letter with a solemn expression. This letter was found hidden in the victim's clothing. Mary Patterson managed to write it while being held captive, and it proves beyond any doubt that the defendant is guilty of the most heinous crimes. The courtroom erupted in fresh excitement as the contents of the letter were read aloud. The document described a horrific tale of kidnapping and murder, with Mary Patterson supposedly writing her final words while being held prisoner by savage Indians. "My dearest sister." The letter read, "I fear this may be my last communication. The Indian savages have taken us prisoner after murdering my beloved husband. They threaten to kill my precious children if I resist their demands. I write this in secret, praying that someone will find it and know the truth of what happened to us." The fabricated accounts seemed to confirm everyone's worst suspicions about Red Elk's guilt, and the courtroom atmosphere turned decisively against the defendant. Defense attorney Fletcher objected weakly, but Judge Hartwell was swayed by the dramatic evidence. The forged letters seemed to resolve all doubts about Red Elk's guilt, and the trial was clearly moving toward a conviction. Red Elk sat in the defendant's chair, his weathered face impassive, as he listened to the fabricated accusations. He had expected injustice from the moment of his arrest, but the elaborate deception still stung deeply. He had risked everything to save 2 dying children, and now he was being painted as their tormentor. But Josie Patterson had been listening carefully to every word, and she had heard enough lies. As Prosecutor Whitman was beginning his summary of the letter's contents, Josie slipped away from Mrs. Henderson's watchful eye. She walked purposefully toward the front of the courtroom, her small figure moving with surprising determination. "Oh, that's not true," she shouted, her clear young voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "That letter is lying. Chief Red Elk didn't kidnap us. He saved our lives." The courtroom erupted in chaos. Judge Hartwell banged his gavel, repeatedly shouting for order, but Josie was already pulling something from her pocket. "He gave me this," she cried, holding up her mother's wedding ring for everyone to see. "He said it was Mama's, and that I should keep it to remember her by. Why would he give me Mama's ring if he hurt her?" The crowd buzzed with confusion and growing doubt. Lieutenant Grady's face had gone pale, and Prosecutor Whitman was shuffling through his papers with obvious distress. Furthermore, Josie continued, her voice gaining strength. "Mama was already dead when he found us. She died 3 days before from the cold. We were trying to eat leather from the wagon because we were so hungry." Mrs. Henderson rushed forward to retrieve the girl, but Josie continued shouting. "Chief Red Elk saved us from the wild animals. He wrapped us in warm blankets and gave us food. He's not a bad man." The courtroom was in complete chaos now, with some people shouting for Red Elk's immediate release, while others demanded the trial continue regardless of the evidence. Judge Hartwell struggled to maintain order, but the momentum had shifted dramatically. That evening, as the court adjourned for the day, Lieutenant Grady retreated to his quarters at the boarding house. His entire career, his reputation, his future prospects, everything depended on Red Elk being found guilty. The girl's testimony had seriously damaged his case, and he knew he had to act quickly to salvage the situation. Working by lamplight, Grady began to craft additional evidence to support his forged letter. He had become desperate, and desperate men make dangerous decisions. What he didn't know was that David Two Horses had been watching the boarding house since sunset. David's mixed heritage had taught him to be observant and cautious, and he had developed a keen instinct for detecting deception. Through the window, he could see Grady hunched over a desk, carefully working on documents by candlelight. The next morning, November 18th court reconvened with a very different atmosphere. The medical evidence and the children's testimony had created serious doubts about the prosecution's case, but Judge Hartwell seemed determined to proceed with the trial. Whitman presented his closing arguments with desperate energy. "Gentlemen of the jury, do not be swayed by the confused testimony of traumatized children or the clinical detachment of medical examination. The evidence of Mary Patterson's own words is clear and undeniable. She wrote her final testimony from captivity, and we must honor her dying wish for justice." Fletcher's closing argument was more confident than before. "The medical evidence is clear. Mary Patterson died of natural causes days before Red Elk found her children. The children themselves testify that he saved their lives. A ring that could have been kept as a trophy was instead given to the daughter as a keepsake. These are not the actions of a killer, but of a compassionate man who risked his own safety to save dying children." The jury retired to deliberate at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. As they discussed the evidence, the crowd outside the courthouse grew increasingly agitated. Many had come expecting a quick conviction, and the possibility of acquittal enraged them. By evening, word had spread that the jury was deadlocked. Some jurors believed the medical evidence and the children's testimony, while others insisted that the letter proved Red Elk's guilt beyond doubt. As night fell on November 18th, the situation turned dangerous. A group of men led by Jake Crenshaw began organizing for direct action. "We can't wait for a hung jury," Crenshaw shouted to a crowd of about 30 men. That savage is guilty as sin, and we all know it. The jury's been poisoned by that doctor and those confused children," added Tom Fletcher. "Sometimes justice has to come from the people themselves. Let's finish this tonight," called out another voice. "String him up and be done with it." Sheriff Bradley tried to maintain order, but he was vastly outnumbered. As the clock struck midnight, the mob began to move. Red Elk was sleeping fitfully in his cell when the smell of smoke woke him. At first, he thought it might be coming from the cook fires of the town, but as the acrid odor grew stronger, he realized with growing alarm that the jail itself was on fire. The vigilantes had poured kerosene around the wooden portions of the building and set them ablaze. Orange flames licked at the edges of the small window, and thick black smoke began pouring into the cell. "Burn him out," Jake Crenshaw shouted drunkenly from outside. "Let's see how brave the savage is when he's roasting alive." The flames spread rapidly up the wooden walls, and Red Elk could feel the heat growing intense. He pressed his face to the barred window, trying to get fresh air, but the smoke was growing thicker by the minute. His eyes watered, and he began to cough violently as the smoke filled his lungs. The heat was becoming unbearable. Red Elk could feel his strength beginning to fade as the smoke made it harder and harder to breathe. He thought of his daughter, Singing Bird, of the 2 little girls he had saved, of his son, Running Bear. If he was to die tonight, at least he would die knowing he had done the right thing. Through the smoke and chaos, he heard the sound of metal striking metal. Someone was working on the lock of his cell door from the outside. "Chief," came a familiar voice through the smoke. "Stay low and cover your face." David Two Horses appeared through the smoke like a ghost. His face blackened with soot, and his clothes singed from the heat. He carried a heavy crowbar and was working frantically to break the lock. "You should not be here," Red Elk said between coughing fits. "You will be killed for helping me. My father died fighting for what he believed in." David replied, his voice strained with effort as he worked the crowbar. "I can do no less for family." The lock finally gave way, with a loud crack, and the cell door swung open. Red Elk stumbled out his legs, weak from smoke inhalation, and his lungs burning with each breath. David grabbed his arm and helped him toward the back of the building where a small door led to an alley. "This way," Uncle David whispered, using the Lakota term that acknowledged their family bond. "I have horses waiting." They emerged into the night air, both men gasping and coughing. The mob was gathered at the front of the building, watching the flames consume the structure and cheering as if they were at a celebration. They had not yet realized that their prisoner had escaped. "We need to reach the courthouse," David said urgently. "Dr. Morrison is waiting there with evidence that will clear your name." Red Elk nodded, though he could barely stand. The smoke had severely damaged his lungs, and his old war wounds were making movement difficult. But the thought of seeing justice done, of protecting Josie and May from further trauma, gave him strength. They made their way through the dark streets, staying in the shadows and avoiding the crowds that had gathered to watch the fire. But as they approached the courthouse, they were spotted by one of the vigilantes who had been posted as a lookout. "There he is," the man shouted. "The savage escaped." The cry was taken up by others. And suddenly the entire mob was running toward them through the streets, their torches casting wild shadows as they gave chase. Red Elk and David broke into a desperate run, but Red Elk's injuries and smoke-damaged lungs slowed them considerably. Behind them, the mob was gaining ground. Someone fired a rifle, and the bullet whined past David's head. Another shot followed, and this one caught Red Elk in the thigh, sending him stumbling and nearly falling. "Keep running," David shouted, supporting his uncle's weight. "We're almost there." Blood was seeping through Red Elk's pants leg, and he was limping heavily. Each step sent pain shooting through his injured leg, but he forced himself to keep moving. Behind them, the mob was getting closer, their voices filled with bloodlust and rage. They reached the courthouse steps just as Lieutenant Grady appeared from the shadows, his pistol drawn and aimed directly at Red Elk's chest. Behind him came Jake Crenshaw and a dozen other men, all armed and furious. End of the line, Redskin. Grady snarled his finger, tightening on the trigger. His face was twisted with desperation and hatred, knowing that his entire future depended on Red Elk's death. Red Elk stopped running and slowly raised his hands, blood still flowing from his wounded leg. "Let the young man go," he said with quiet dignity. "He has done nothing wrong except show courage. That half-breed helped a murderer escape." Crenshaw spat, weaving slightly from alcohol. "He's as guilty as you are." David stepped forward, his jaw set with determination. "I helped an innocent man escape a lynch mob. If that makes me guilty of something, then I'm proud to be guilty." The standoff continued in the flickering light of the burning jail. The mob had surrounded them completely, cutting off any hope of escape. Grady's pistol remained trained on Red Elk's chest, and the hatred in his eyes was unmistakable. "You've destroyed everything I worked for," Grady said through gritted teeth. "My reputation, my career, my future all ruined because of you and those lying children." "I am not your enemy," Red Elk replied calmly despite the pain and exhaustion. "I am simply a man who could not watch children die." "I tell that to the devil when you meet him." Grady snarled his finger, beginning to squeeze the trigger. At that moment, the courthouse doors burst open with a tremendous crash. Dr. Morrison emerged, carrying a lantern and several documents, his elderly frame moving with surprising energy and purpose. Behind him came Josie and May, both girls running toward Red Elk, despite the obvious danger. "Chief Red Elk," May cried, throwing her small arms around his waist, heedless of the guns pointed at him. "Stop!" Dr. Morrison shouted, his voice carrying the authority of age and moral conviction. "All of you stop this madness immediately." The crowd hesitated, confused by the doctor's dramatic intervention. Grady kept his pistol trained on Red Elk, but the presence of the children made him hesitate to fire. "Get those children away from that savage doctor," Grady demanded, his voice shaking with barely controlled rage. "This man is no savage," Dr. Morrison declared, holding up his documents. "He is a hero who saved these children's lives, and I have irrefutable proof of his innocence." The doctor's words created a moment of uncertainty in the crowd. Some of the men began to lower their weapons, while others remained skeptical and hostile. "I have here," Dr. Morrison continued, his voice carrying across the square, "not only the complete medical evidence of Mary Patterson's natural death, but also proof that the letter presented in court today is a forgery." "That's impossible," Grady said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I have examined the letter under magnification." Dr. Morrison pressed on relentlessly. "The ink is fresh, manufactured no earlier than yesterday. The paper is new, not aged by travel and hardship. Most importantly, the handwriting shows clear signs of careful copying rather than natural writing." He pulled out a magnifying glass and held it up. "Anyone can see the difference between authentic handwriting and skillful forgery. The letter is fake, manufactured by someone who needed to prop up a failing case." The crowd murmured with growing confusion and doubt. Several men began to look at Lieutenant Grady with suspicion rather than respect. "Furthermore," Dr. Morrison continued, "I have here a sworn statement from a witness who saw the forger at work." David Two Horses stepped forward, his voice clear and strong. "I saw Lieutenant Grady creating that letter 2 nights ago. I watched him copying handwriting from other documents, practicing the forgery until he got it right." Grady's face went pale and his hand began to tremble visibly. "You're lying. Both of you are lying. The evidence speaks for itself," Dr. Morrison replied. "The letter is a fraud created by a man who needed to justify his false, heroic story. Red Elk stood in the center of the mob, one arm around May, and the other hand resting protectively on Josie's shoulder. Despite the guns pointed at him, despite the hatred in many of the surrounding faces, he remained calm and dignified. "I will not run from the truth," he said, his voice carrying across the square. "These children have suffered enough. They deserve to grow up in peace without the shadow of lies hanging over their memories." The simple dignity of his words, combined with the sight of the two children clinging to him with obvious love and trust, began to work on the crowd. Some of the men started to lower their weapons, their faces showing confusion and growing shame. But Lieutenant Grady was beyond reason now. His entire identity, his future, his very sense of self, depended on Red Elk being seen as a villain. He could not allow the truth to destroy his carefully constructed deception. "Enough!" he screamed, raising his pistol with both hands. "I don't care what anyone says, this savage dies tonight, and I'm going to be the one to kill him." As his finger tightened on the trigger, several things happened simultaneously. David Two Horses lunged forward, trying to knock the gun aside. Dr. Morrison stepped between Grady and Red Elk, his frail body shielding the Lakota chief. And from the crowd, 3 townsmen who had been wavering suddenly moved forward to grab Grady's arms. "No," shouted Henry Walsh, the town blacksmith. "This has gone too far." The pistol discharged harmlessly into the air as the men wrestled it away from Grady. The lieutenant struggled desperately, his face twisted with rage and desperation. "You're all fools," he screamed. "Can't you see what he is? He's a savage, a killer. He'll murder your children next." "The only person who tried to murder anyone tonight was you," Dr. Morrison said firmly, his voice carrying moral authority that cut through the chaos. Sheriff Bradley finally arrived with his deputies, having been alerted by the commotion. He quickly took control of the situation, arresting Grady for attempted murder, arson, and inciting a riot. As the crowd gradually dispersed, the truth of the situation became clear to everyone present. The forged letter was examined by multiple witnesses under Dr. Morrison's magnifying glass, and its fraudulent nature became undeniable. Several townspeople who had been caught up in the mob mentality began to feel deep shame for their actions. Dr. Morrison treated Red Elk's bullet wound and smoke inhalation in his clinic, while Josie and May refused to leave the chief's side. The girls held his hands as the doctor worked their presence, providing comfort to the man who had saved their lives. "Will you be all right?" May asked, her small voice filled with genuine concern. "I will heal, little one," Red Elk replied gently. "Thanks to brave friends who stood up for truth when it mattered most." David Two Horses sat nearby, his own injuries from the fire being tended by Dr. Morrison's wife. Despite the danger he had faced, he showed no regret for his actions. "My father would be proud," he said quietly to Red Elk. "We stood up for what was right, even when it was dangerous." "Your father was a man of honor," Red Elk replied. "And you have proven that his courage runs true in your blood, nephew." The word hung in the air between them, and David felt a surge of emotion at finally knowing his true family connection. He had found not just an uncle, but a hero whose example would guide him for the rest of his life. The next morning, November 19th, the trial resumed with a completely different atmosphere. The forged letter had been exposed as a fraud, and Lieutenant Grady's testimony was revealed to be a fabrication. Prosecutor Whitman, faced with the complete collapse of his case, had no choice but to withdraw the charges of kidnapping and murder. However, Judge Hartwell, still influenced by the racial prejudices of the time and political pressure from certain segments of the community, refused to dismiss all charges entirely. He convicted Red Elk on the lesser charge of unlawful entry into territorial lands without proper authorization, and sentenced him to 3 months in the territorial prison. It was a compromise that satisfied no one completely, but it allowed Red Elk to live. The sentence was far less than what he had originally faced, and it acknowledged, however reluctantly, that he was not the monster he had been portrayed as. Defense attorney Fletcher, emboldened by the revelation of the truth, made an impassioned plea for complete dismissal. "Your Honor, this man risked his own life and the safety of his people to save 2 children from certain death. He should be receiving a Medal of Honor, not a prison sentence." But Judge Hartwell was unmoved by appeals to justice. The defendant entered territorial lands without proper authorization and interfered with civilian matters. While his intentions may have been honorable, the law must be upheld regardless of circumstances. Red Elk accepted the sentence with characteristic dignity. As he was led away to serve his time, Josie and May were allowed to say goodbye. "Will we see you again?" Josie asked, tears streaming down her face. "I will always be with you," Red Elk replied, kneeling to their level. "In your hearts, in your memories, and in the kindness you show to others throughout your lives." May hugged him tightly, not wanting to let go. "I love you, Chief Red Elk. You're the best man I ever knew, and I love you both more than you can possibly understand. Never forget that you are brave and strong, and that you survived because you took care of each other." As Red Elk was taken away, Dr. Morrison approached the girls with gentle compassion. "Come," he said softly. "You have a permanent home with Helen and me for as long as you need it." 3 months later, in February 1883, Red Elk was released from prison and returned to his people. The Lakota welcomed him back as a hero, and his story became part of the oral tradition that would be passed down through generations. Lieutenant Grady was court-martialed for his crimes and dismissed from the Army in disgrace. He left the territory in shame and was never heard from again, his dreams of military glory forever shattered by his own deception and hatred. But the story did not end there. Josie and May, now living permanently with Dr. and Mrs. Morrison, never forgot the man who had saved their lives. As they grew older, they made it their mission to tell everyone who would listen about Red Elk's true character and the injustice he had suffered. In June 1883, when Red Elk had been free for 4 months, the girls convinced Dr. Morrison to take them to the Lakota reservation for a visit. The reunion was emotional and profound, with Red Elk embracing the girls like the daughters he had lost. "You have grown," he said with pride, "and I can see the strength in your faces." "We've been telling everyone your story," Josie said. "We want the whole world to know what really happened. And we brought you something," May added, pulling out a small package. Inside was a photograph of the 3 of them together, taken by the town photographer before their visit. "So, you'll always remember us." Red Elk's eyes filled with tears as he looked at the photograph. "I could never forget you, little ones. You are part of my family now and always." The girls thrived under the Morrisons' care, attending school and becoming educated young women. Josie showed a particular aptitude for writing, and she began documenting the true story of their rescue, determined that history would remember Red Elk correctly. David Two Horses, inspired by his discovery of his family connection and his act of courage, eventually left Cottonwood Bend to attend college in the East. He became a lawyer, specializing in Native American rights, dedicating his career to preventing the kind of injustice his uncle had suffered. Every year, on November 10th, at the anniversary of the rescue, the girls would send a letter to Red Elk, telling him about their lives and thanking him for his sacrifice. These letters became precious treasures to the old chief, proof that his act of mercy had truly mattered. Dr. Morrison, who had risked his reputation and safety to stand up for justice, became a respected voice for racial tolerance in the territory. His actions that night inspired others to question their prejudices and work toward a more just society. As the years passed, the children of Cottonwood Bend began to hear a different version of the story. Instead of tales of savage kidnappers, they heard about a brave chief who had risked everything to save 2 little girls. Some of these children, moved by the story, began secretly leaving food and supplies at the edge of the Lakota reservation during harsh winter months. These anonymous gifts became a tradition that continued for decades, a quiet acknowledgement of the debt the town owed to Red Elk and his people. The practice started with just a few children, but it grew as the true story spread until entire families were participating in the annual winter gift giving. In their 20s, Josie and May both married and started families of their own. But they never forgot their origins or their debt to the man who had saved them. They ensured that the story of Red Elk was passed down to their children and grandchildren, creating a legacy of gratitude and understanding. As they entered their later years, the sisters launched a formal campaign to clear Red Elk's name completely. They wrote letters to newspapers throughout the territory, spoke at public gatherings, and lobbied territorial officials to acknowledge the injustice that had been done. Their efforts proved successful. In 1923, 41 years after the original trial, the state government issued a formal pardon for Red Elk, acknowledging that he had been wrongly convicted and honoring him as a hero who had saved 2 children's lives. The town of Cottonwood Bend, now grown into a small city, erected a granite monument at the site of the old jail. The inscription read, "In memory of Chief Red Elk of the Lakota Nation, who risked his life to save 2 children and was wrongly convicted for his act of mercy. May his courage and compassion serve as an example to all who pass this way." The monument's dedication ceremony, held on November 10, 1923, exactly 41 years after the rescue, drew hundreds of people from throughout the region. Josie and May, now in their late 40s, stood together as they had that terrible night so many years ago. But the most surprising revelation came during David Two Horse's speech at the dedication. David, now an elderly man of 67 and a respected civil rights lawyer, had kept one secret for over 40 years. "I have a confession to make," he said to the gathered crowd, his voice carrying clearly across the square. Chief Red Elk was not just a hero to me, he was family. Through genealogical research I conducted years after these events, I discovered that my father, Swift Arrow, was Red Elk's younger brother. Red Elk was my uncle, though neither of us knew it when we first met. The crowd murmured with amazement as David continued, his voice thick with emotion. "My mother never told me the full truth about my father's family connections, and Red Elk never knew that Swift Arrow had survived to have a son. It was only when I began researching Native American tribal records for my legal work that I discovered the family connection." He pulled out a small object from his pocket, a carved bone medallion. "My father gave me this before he died, telling me it was a family heirloom. When I visited Red Elk years later, I learned that he had an identical medallion made by their father for both his sons. That's when I knew for certain that we were blood relatives." The revelation added a final layer of meaning to the story. Red Elk had not only saved 2 white children from certain death, but had also unknowingly been saved by his own nephew, creating a circle of family loyalty and love that transcended racial boundaries. Josie and May, now grandmothers themselves, stood together at the monument's dedication, and their hands clasped as they had been that terrible night so many years ago. They had lived full lives, raised families, and contributed to their communities, but they had never forgotten the debt they owed to a Lakota chief who had chosen compassion over convenience. He told us we were brave. Josie said in her speech that day, her voice carrying the authority of lived experience. But Chief Red Elk was the truly brave one. He risked everything for 2 little girls he didn't even know, and he did it because his heart would not allow him to do otherwise. May added her own words, her voice soft but clear. "He taught us that family is not just about blood, it's about the people who choose to love and protect you when you need it most." Chief Red Elk became our family, and we became his. The ceremony concluded with a traditional Lakota blessing performed by Red Elk's great-grandson, who had traveled from the Pine Ridge Reservation to honor his ancestors' memory. As the sun set over the Dakota plains, the monument stood as a testament to the power of truth and the importance of justice and the enduring bonds of love that connect all human beings. Years later, during routine maintenance of the monument, workers discovered a small hidden compartment in the base that had been sealed since construction. Inside was a bundle wrapped in buffalo hide, a gift from Red Elk's family to the town that had finally acknowledged his heroism. The bundle contained 2 pairs of small beaded moccasins, carefully crafted by Lakota women, along with a note written in both English and Lakota. For the 2 brave girls who flew far from home, but never forgot where they came from. May they always walk in beauty and remember that love transcends all boundaries. The moccasins were placed in the town's historical museum, where they serve as a lasting symbol of the bonds that connect all people, regardless of race or culture. The museum display includes the full story of the rescue told from multiple perspectives and supported by historical documents and photographs. In the end, Red Elk's legacy lived on, not just in the monument that bore his name, but in the countless lives he had touched and the example he had set. He had shown that true strength lies not in the ability to destroy, but in the willingness to protect and preserve life, even at great personal cost. The 2 little girls he had saved from that terrible Dakota blizzard grew up to be pillars of their community. Their lives a testament to the power of one man's decision to choose mercy over indifference. And in their children and grandchildren, the spirit of Red Elk's compassion continued to flourish, ensuring that his story would never be forgotten. The final chapter of this remarkable story was written not in words, but in the countless acts of kindness and individual courage that Red Elk's example inspired in others. For in the end, that is the true measure of a hero, not the fame they achieve in life, but the goodness they inspire in others long after they are gone. The story of Red Elk and the 2 little girls became part of the permanent historical record of the American West, not as a tale of savage violence and racial conflict, but as a story of courage, compassion, and the ultimate triumph of truth over prejudice. It demonstrated that heroism comes in many forms, and that sometimes the greatest courage is shown not in violence, but in the simple act of choosing to save a life when it would be easier to look away. Red Elk had lived to see his name cleared and his story told truthfully. He died peacefully in 1920 at the age of 91, surrounded by his family on the reservation, knowing that the 2 little girls he had saved were now successful women who continued to honor his memory. At his funeral, representatives from Cottonwood Bend attended alongside hundreds of Lakota mourners. Josie and May, now middle-aged women with families of their own, spoke at the ceremony about the man who had changed their lives forever. He saved us from death. Josie said, her voice carrying across the gathering. But more than that, he saved us from hatred. He showed us that people of different races could love and protect each other, and that lesson has guided our entire lives. May added, we became living proof that his sacrifice mattered. Every day we lived, every child we raised, every act of kindness we performed. All of it was possible because one man chose to do what was right instead of what was safe. The community change that Red Elk's story inspired lasted for generations. Cottonwood Bend became known throughout the territory as a place where Native Americans could expect fair treatment, where individual courage was valued over conformity, and where the true story of the past was preserved and honored. David Two Horses continued his legal career until his death in 1935, having successfully argued dozens of cases involving Native American rights. His law firm, which he named Swift Arrow and Associates, in honor of his father, became a beacon of justice for marginalized communities throughout the West. The annual tradition of leaving gifts at the reservation boundary continued until the 1950s, when improved relations between the communities made such secretive gestures unnecessary. By then, the town and the reservation had developed open trade relationships and mutual respect that would have seemed impossible in 1882. The final testament to Red Elk's legacy came in 1960, when the town of Cottonwood Bend and the Lakota Reservation jointly established a scholarship program for students of all backgrounds who demonstrated exceptional compassion and moral courage. The Red Elk Memorial Scholarship continues to this day, ensuring that his example of selfless service continues to inspire new generations. In the end, what began as a simple act of mercy on a frozen Dakota morning became a story that transcended racial boundaries, challenged prejudice, and demonstrated the power of individual courage to change entire communities. Red Elk's decision to save 2 dying children created ripple effects that lasted for decades, proving that a single act of compassion can indeed change the world. The 2 little girls who had been saved from death in the Dakota Territory grew up to become forces for positive change in their own right. They lived long, productive lives, always remembering the lesson that Red Elk had taught them, that true strength lies not in the ability to harm, but in the willingness to help those who cannot help themselves. And so the story of Red Elk, the Lakota chief, who risked everything to save 2 white children, became more than just a tale of rescue. It became a testament to the fundamental truth that compassion knows no boundaries of race, culture, or background. It demonstrated that heroism is not defined by the color of one's skin or the circumstances of one's birth, but by the choices one makes when faced with the suffering of others. The monument in Cottonwood Bend still stands today, weathered by decades of Dakota winters, but still bearing its message of hope and reconciliation. Visitors from around the world come to read the inscription and learn about the man who chose love over hatred, mercy over revenge, and courage over safety. In the end, Red Elk's greatest victory was not that he was eventually pardoned or that his story was finally told correctly. His greatest victory was that he had saved 2 lives, and in doing so had planted seeds of understanding and compassion that would continue to grow for generations to come. The blizzard that had threatened to claim the lives of Josie and May Patterson on that terrible November morning in 1882 had indeed passed. But the warmth of Red Elk's compassion, the strength of his character, and the power of his example would endure forever, a lasting reminder that even in the darkest moments, the human capacity for goodness can shine through like a beacon of hope.